In advance of the impeachment hearing on Ali Mayorkas, he's your Secretary of Homeland Security. He made his way down to Eagle Pass, Texas, following in the footsteps of House Speaker Mike Johnson and that GOP congressional delegation that went last week. And he addressed straight away this silly notion that some people have that DHS is not enforcing federal immigration laws. I don't know where people get this, says Ali Mayorkas.
Some have accused DHS of not enforcing our nation's laws. This could not be further from the truth. Having begun my public service career as a federal prosecutor for 12 years, ultimately serving as the United States Attorney, there is nothing I take more seriously than our responsibility to uphold the law. And the men and women of DHS are working around the clock to do so. We are doing everything we can within a broken system to incentivize non-citizens to use lawful pathways, to impose consequences on those who do not, and to reduce irregular migration.
Irregular migration, please add that to your woke to English dictionary. Irregular migration means illegal immigration.
Right. Or, as I say, an invasion. Yes.
Yeah, irregular migration. I like that. That's very sweet sounding. Yeah. Interestingly, so you see what Mayorkas did there. First of all, he hides behind the men and women of Border Patrol. To criticize me is to criticize them. I stand with them, using them as political shields. Par for the course. And the issue of enforcing the law, he talked about the record-setting number of people they've turned away at the border and so on and so forth, though he doesn't really address the underlying why is there record-setting number of people at the border. Anyway, despite all that, Bill Malugin over at Fox News reporting the following. Per 3 Border Patrol sources who were in the room while privately meeting with agents in Eagle Pass, and so they're in this room, Mayorkas admitted to them that the current release rate for migrants caught crossing the border illegally is above 85%. So, yeah. Where do people get this idea that Mayorkas and this administration is not serious about 12 million encounters and maybe 2 million gotaways, a number they won't even discuss? Where do they get this notion the law isn't being enforced? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Dan Henninger, because this topic will certainly inform some votes on Monday, the Iowa caucus. Dan Henninger is the deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, of course. Dan, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Dan.
So, Mayorkas's fate is part of the conversation. This, again, all against the backdrop of a potential spending deal between House Republicans and Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans, for that matter. What do you think the sensible play here as Biden is clearly flailing as a result of the lawlessness at the border?
Well, the sensible play, I think, Dan, and this would be from Joe Biden's point of view, would be in this supplemental bill, of course, that they're working on over funding for Ukraine, Israel, and that includes restored enforcement at the border, which would slow down the number of people coming across the border. I think that's something Joe Biden should sign on to, for sure. Republicans are pushing for it. I don't think they're going to get House Bill 42 or number 2 into that, but he should really sign on to something like this because his numbers on immigration are so terrible, Dan. And we know that it's creating problems for him across the Democratic Party generally. No one needs to be told what's going on in Chicago or here in New York City or in places like Denver. It's a big political problem for Joe Biden. The flip side of that is represented by Secretary Mayorkas. there are many parts of the Democratic Party that are simply okay with all of these people flowing illegally across the border. And incidentally, I've listened pretty closely to your Mayor Johnson and Mayor Johnson in Denver, and they don't particularly complain about the people coming across the border. Their problem is that there isn't enough federal funding to help them disperse these people.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
So Joe Biden is, on the one hand, worried about his left flank, that he might annoy them if he shut down the border, or at least tighten the border. But more generally, I think with the general voting population, he'd do himself a favor if he got this off the table. But so far, you guys are as well as aware as I am, Biden seems to keep playing to his left, terrified that they're going to desert him in the election in November.
Well, so what do Republicans have to have, in your view, in order to cut any sort of deal on funding? Because obviously there's going to be a contingent of the House Republican caucus that's in the Tom Homan camp and wants to shut down the government until policy changes, significant policy changes like Remain, like asylum applications only if you enter at a designated port of entry and so forth. Those are have-to-haves in order for them to sign on to any spending deal.
I think the biggest thing they need to have, and the one thing they should insist on, is a rollback of what's known as humanitarian parole, right? Humanitarian parole is a euphemism for catch and release. That's what's going on. These people come to the border, they make a generalized claim of persecution, and they're let go and sent into the country. If that were reversed, if you simply could not show up and say, I have a problem, and get released and say, I'll come back, 4 or 5 years later for an asylum claim, I think that would significantly slow down the flow of people coming across the border. I mean, I saw a report on CNN last night, Dan, about the extraordinary number of people coming from China.
Yeah.
They're paying $20,000 to get on planes to fly into South America and literally sign up with people, putting them up in Airbnbs and people in places like Honduras, and then they get accompanied up to the border. And for paying even a little more money, they can get a taxi cab to drive them across the border. It's from China, and people are coming now from Africa.
It's 31,000 Chinese in 2023, and most of them are young men, and that causes concern for people.
And they look pretty well educated to me as well. The border is open, and anybody who is upset about their lot anywhere in the world, such as in northern Africa, because they've shut down some of the passageways into Europe, they're now rerouting themselves to the southern border of the United States. And whatever one's views of immigration, and my views of immigration are pretty positive, at least legal immigration, it is clearly falling apart for Joe Biden. And the question is whether he has the strength to address it.
Well, clearly, the Mexican president, AMLO, believes he doesn't, because the proposal that he made, $20 billion for Latin America and the sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, and 10 million. 10 million give essentially legal status and right to work to 10 million Latinos that are currently residing in America without those things. And that's for some sort of vague promise of helping old Joe in D.C. I mean, that is a really telling offer by AMLO, it seems to me, what he thinks, where he thinks Joe Biden is on this.
We agree, Dan. I thought that was just bad faith on AMLO's part, virtually amounting to attempting to blackmail the president of the United States. I mean, one of the most fantastic things he said in that negotiation is that he wants the U.S., as part of any agreement by him, to open normalization negotiations with Cuba. I mean, you just had to stand back and say, what is he talking about? Mm-hmm. Normalization with Cuba? That has nothing to do with what's going on at the southern border.
Yeah, but doesn't it?
Obviously has its own agenda.
Well, but doesn't it also speak to AMLO thinks incredibly AMLO thinks he has Biden over a barrel when America should have Mexico over a barrel on this.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And the cartels are making hundreds of millions of dollars off of smuggling these people in the United States. That money in some way flows back into the Mexican economy. So the United States is simply going to have to get tougher with Mexico, and one of the ways to do that is to reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy. The problem with that policy, Dan, is that was an order that Donald Trump issued, and the problem with executive orders, as I wrote last week, is they're reversible. Joe Biden reversed many of Trump's orders in the first couple of weeks of his presidency. And what we're eventually going to need is a piece of legislation out of Congress to give that policy like that stronger teeth.
Well, do you think Biden's going to negotiate with the president of Mexico? I mean, he wants $20 billion money to go to Latin America, Caribbean countries. He wants grant work visas to 10 million Hispanics who've worked in the U.S. for at least 10 years. And then, end sanctions against Venezuela and blockage of Cuba.
No, I don't think he's going to negotiate with them. I mean, he might well send Mayorkas down. Obviously, Secretary Mayorkas isn't going to negotiate anything like that. But this is one thing to get onto another subject. This is one of the problems of having a president as weakened as Joe Biden is. The country's foreign affairs cannot solely be run by the Secretary of State. You need a strong president to be able to deal with an AMLO or with Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin and the rest of the world's leaders. And I watched Joe Biden give that speech in Charleston yesterday at the Black Church, and I thought it was a terrible performance. Halting, muddled, slurring his words. It simply wasn't impressive. And the idea that that guy is going to negotiate a serious border agreement with the president of Mexico is inconceivable.
What about the substance of what he had to say in South Carolina, sort of building off what he said in Valley Forge on Friday, and the characterization essentially that, January 6th, of course, we've heard this before, that an attempt to overthrow the country, overthrow the government and seize control of and install a MAGA dictatorship, and it came within an inch of happening. And then he transitions, says, and that same mob, January 6th mob, which is all Trump voters, they went from January 6th to banning books and doing all these other preventing people from voting and doing all these other horrible things too. I mean, do you think that sort of scapegoating and that sort of a creative storytelling is going to claw Biden back into this race?
Obviously, that's what they think. They're not, at this point, not going to run on their record. I think that the risk he's running there, Dan, in pushing that argument so far is that it ends up not being just about Trump, and also not just about the Trumpians, the tightest supporters of Donald Trump. He runs the risk that people on the outer perimeter of that, who might be, say, sympathetic to Trump's policies when he was president, they begin to think he's talking about them as well, that he's insulting them and dragging them into this indictment of Donald Trump. And so I think Biden does run the risk here of overstating this case against Trump. But, boy, that Valley Forge speech named Trump 44 times. Clearly, this is Exhibit A in the Trump reelection campaign.
If Trump wins the Iowa caucus on Monday by, something approximating where the polls had it going into Christmas, 30 points, 25 points, 30 points. I mean, is the race over?
We'll have to wait, I think, for New Hampshire at least to see whether the race is over. It kind of looks effectively over. Trump is in the news. He's going to be in the news today with this appearance before the appeals court in Washington over his immunity claim. And it just kind of sucks the oxygen out of the Republican primaries. This is what people are reading and thinking about, and I think it probably is going to add up to a Trump victory in these early primaries. But you know, we've been talking about polls all this time, Dan. We got to see some real voters show up and express their opinion. So I'm willing to wait at least through New Hampshire to see which way the wind is blowing with Republican voters.
He is Dan Henninger, deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. Dan, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Good to talk to you guys.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.